Yeah, all those people knocking. Yeah, all those people knocking. They want to be free. They want to be free. They want to be free. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. Say it louder. No justice, no peace. Say it louder. No justice, no peace. What's his name? What's his name? What's his name? Say his name.
Good evening, and welcome to the latest installment of our Unmasked series. My name is Afeni Grace. I am the program coordinator for the Harvey B. Gantt Center. And tonight we deepen conversations surrounding police reform by including local and national perspectives on the topic, particularly addressing how the city of Charlotte will be impacted with these reforms in place. But before we get started, please be sure to click that subscribe button below the screen to be updated on all future Gantt Center programs. Also, visit our website, ganttcenter.org, for updates on all things Gantt Center related. As with our previous conversations, we have linked in our YouTube chat now a 2-minute audience survey. If you haven't had the chance to complete the survey, please do so now. And we also love to see such great audience engagement. So please feel free to use that YouTube chat for any questions or comments that you have throughout the evening. We will discuss the survey results and the audience questions in the second half of the program. Now, we welcome our moderator for this evening, Dr. Keith Cradle. Keith is the Director of Youth Programs for the Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Office and is responsible for youth offenders dealing with detention and the successful implementation of rehabilitation and youth development initiatives. Thank you for guiding the discussion tonight, Keith.
Thank you, Afeni, and good evening, all. We thank you for joining us for this ever so important discussion tonight as we continue to look at how we can reform and change our community for the better. Tonight, we've got three dynamic persons and human beings that I so enjoy talking to, and I hope that you enjoyed listening to them as well. So first up, I'm going to introduce Cass Otley. So Cass is the founder and CEO of Seeking Justice Charlotte, a civil rights activist, an organizer, and a Charlotte business owner in Charlotte, North Carolina. Cass started Seeking Justice Consortium to bring smaller groups and organizations that have decided to work together to achieve one common goal, justice. Good evening, Cass. How you doing?
Good evening. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. And with all these discussions, I know there's a lot going on. You've been out in those streets. So can you just give us a brief overview of how you're doing, how you're handling things, and what's going on with you?
Handling things pretty well. Sometimes it does get emotional with all the shootings and all the loss. I will say I'm very excited about the turnout and the diverseness of the crowd and people from all walks of life wanting to help and wanting to get involved.
And thank you for all the work that you do. So if I don't say it before we end tonight, I just want to make sure you hear from me tonight. Thank you for everything that you're doing.
Thank you.
Our second panelist, Robert Dawkins. Robert is the political director for Action North Carolina and the founder and state organizer for Safe Coalition North Carolina, which is a project of Action North Carolina and made up over 15 community-based advocacy groups working to end discriminatory profiling and promote civil liberty protections for all North Carolina residents. Dawkins, my man, what's going on?
Cradle, how you doing?
I'm good, brother. Always good to see you. I think I just told you I saw you on the news a few minutes ago. So glad you could split some time and come join us.
Glad to be here. Glad to be with Cass. Glad to be with the chief.
Well, we appreciate you, man. And our final panelist tonight, Chief Deputy Jeffrey Estes. And Chief Estes entered the law enforcement profession in late 1992 and has steadily worked his way through the agency's ranks, appointed to Deputy Chief of Police in 2015. Chief Estes is currently serving as the head of special services for the organization. He has previously held the title of Chief Administration, Chief of Investigations, as well as Chief of Patrol, which included responsibility for nearly 1,200 police officers, detectives, and civilian employees in his jurisdiction. Good evening, Chief. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much. Before we get started, I really do want to say how much of an honor and a privilege it is to be able to discuss this important topic. I believe this is a monumental time in our society, and I'm just honored to be able to discuss reforms and changes in a good, solid, and positive way. So thank you for that.
So, Chief, let's just jump right into it. Since you brought up reforms, this conversation is about police reform and what we can do in our community. So the first question that I have to you, what can we do if these reforms are not implemented and officers are not being convicted? We recognize that while arrests may happen, while things may go to trial, if officers aren't being convicted, where will we see change, and what is your opinion upon that?
Yes, I think what you need to do is if reform, first just to say reform needs to be done, in my opinion, in a holistic manner. That means that not just driven by the police department, not just driven by politicians, but driven by the community in conjunction with those other groups. That's the only way we're going to get a consensus as to what we want our police departments to look like, what we want them to do, what we expect of them. And then if we get outcomes that don't meet that, then there's no misunderstandings and we're all headed forward in the same way. If those reforms aren't being met, then people have to get to know their police department, their police leadership, people like me, chief of police, the district attorney, other leaders like are on this panel right here, so that the reforms that's not being made or the outcomes aren't what's expected can be voiced and heard and understood so that we can move forward. One quick thing to say, I've been listening to everything that's taken place. I want to make sure people understand reform is not I see that the yard line behind Mr. Dawkins back there, and it reminds me, this is not like where we reach a touchdown or a yard line and say, okay, reform is over. Reform is a continual process. As society changes, as we change the things that we need to do, we need to just recognize reform, in my mind, is an ongoing conversation, a dialogue with people who are being policed and the police that are doing that work.
So I want to bring Cass in. So, Cass, you've been working vigilantly for police reform. So what does successful police reform look like for you?
Successful police reform to me looks like part of what he was saying, basically, for the community to be involved. And I think for a long time, the community has been coming out. We've been speaking up about the things we want to see. And I feel like it's kind of falling on deaf ears a lot. The community is asking for certain things and we're just not getting it. And I think that's why the community is frustrated. And I think that's why we're not seeing the changes that we want to see. We want to see police come into our community and de-escalate situations. We want to see police officers that have an invested interest in the community that they serve instead of outside officers that don't know the community, don't know the people coming in. So, those are some of the things that we want to see.
And so, Robert, I'm gonna jump over to you. So you've been working with and around law enforcement for years. This is a big part of your platform. So when you hear some of those things about police reform, what specifically is on your agenda, and what are you looking to see from CMPD?
I take up where Kaz left off. So you have a lot of times in these situations, we fight for change. We even get to the point to where we actually make the policy, but the implementation is bad, or the loopholes that are created from the time you talk to the police to the time you get to city council to the time you get a finished document, they don't always look like what you started with. So the reform piece is one issue, but the implementation and the changing of words to keep the status quo as close to possible is what leads to the frustration, not only on the advocacy side, but on the policy side. So that's our frustration. Kaz and the people that are doing the work in the street, we can't get our policy heard most of the time without them making it to a situation where everybody has to stop and look. So then when we try to make the policy based on the demands of the people, it gets watered down so that it's frustrating, and it's always set that we've got to go back and keep reforming the reforms.
So, Chief, I want to go back to you. As Robert has talked about that frustration, what the community is feeling, what they're seeing, how does CMPD internalize that frustration and information they're getting from folk that are working those streets? And when you get the information, what do you do with it?
Yeah, I think Robert hit on exactly sort of where I was headed to say it shouldn't be a change driven by any one of the groups. It could be all done together. That way, there is no misunderstanding or frustration when a document comes out different than intended. So there's a feedback loop to say, no, that's not what we wanted this. And then we can say, when I say we, I'm talking about CMPD at this point, can say, well, here's the reason why, or here's what we would like to see. And in other words, just to say, it should be, in my opinion, an ongoing process, because at the end of the day, a lot of times there are things that we have in place that we can refine and tweak and make good, solid reform, meaningful reform, I'll say, versus some window dressing that we put up and there's nothing that changes until the next thing happens. And then I think where Robert's talking about now, and Cass, the whole process starts over again, right? All the frustration that kind of boils over, and then here we are again. So I think the point I was making about continual is we're all working together, there's no surprise from Cass or Robert to say, hey, this policy, we want to change it. Like, for example, we talked about the signal sidearm, where it's a technology that we're rolling out where if an officer draws his weapon, automatically their camera and every other camera around them takes the video. I think that's something we all can get behind and say, hey, what's the policy around that? What does that work? That way we all know the situation and what the policy is.
So speaking of initiatives, Cass, I want to ask you, 8 Can't Wait is one of the big slogans, one of the big things that's happening right now. How long do you think it will take for Charlotte to approve all 8? And is Charlotte still on track towards approving the remaining 5 initiatives?
From what I understand, from what I saw, the feedback from CMPD, most of the things they said they've pretty much implemented. You know, the warning shot, they said they implemented that in April of 2003. Also the part where they exhaust all of, you know, everything that they can do before they go to using deadly force. But, you know, I saw that, but then I see other things when it's not being implemented. So I'm confused as to how they're saying they did that in 2013, and you had Jonathan Farrell get shot, you had Danquarius Franklin get shot, and there was no, you know, warning before shots were fired. So, you know, that goes to trust and that goes to accountability, because if that's the case, I'm confused because it wasn't implemented. And if it isn't, if the officer doesn't do it, what's going to happen to the officer? You know, are they fired or are they going to be reprimanded? In the case that Danquarius Franklin died, somebody going to be charged? So there's somewhat confusion there.
Chief, do you want to speak to that at all?
Sure. So I will say, you know, we do have we believe in all of the eight. We have them in policy, but I will say, without speaking to the specifics just yet, we also don't believe that eight is enough. So we have other reforms that we believe are germane to what's going on and the conversation that we think we can make that makes the police department more representative of what the community wants and demands. So while we have eight in policy, then we have some others that we think that we'll be rolling out shortly that we think are important. And I just want to say some of these we've had implemented for a long time, like chokeholds and strangleholds. Those have been, and the shooting moving vehicles, I think, since the 80s. So some of these things that we, you know, all of these things in the eight aren't representative of what we have here. Now, I think to Cass's point, you know, for some of those, I know that we you know, the policy implementation part of a specific criminal case that arises from you know, an officer-involved shooting, you know, a lot of times the policy part, it breaks down more into criminal law with the district attorney and the investigation at this time, what the SBI, State Bureau of Investigation, says and what they don't say in a particular case. So it's hard to go back and say, okay, in the Jonathan Farrell case, you know, the officer's charged, not charged, or whatever. The bottom line is I understand the disconnect between what we have as far as, you know, the policy goes and the eight that we have in place versus real life outcomes that look like that. And I think that's where the Cass's frustration is. And it goes back to an understanding that, for example, these eight and the other eight more, everybody has a clear understanding of what the policy is, and then they can look at the facts of whatever case that's before them and do a you know, review to say, well, didn't make it on this one, or yes, it did, and then communicate right back to the stakeholders we've had in place the entire time.
Thank you. So Robert, I want to jump back over to you. What methods have you found the most effective for initiating change within law enforcement?
I mean, I hate to say it, us on the policy side, we will make good policy. We will have to go through. There are some things that I can take straight to the police. So if that's something that has to do with SOPs, the standards of procedures, I can take that straight to Chief Putney or Chief Estes, and we'll start the process working with them on them, because that pretty much stands outside of the city council process. If it's not, and it's something that you need city council approval, the process gets so convoluted. There's no communication plenty of times between the city council and the police. There's no communication between the city council subcommittee on safety and the other 7 members. And that part gets seriously frustrating. The strongest thing that we've been able to do, and I hate to say it, is leverage bad police experiences coupled with the mobilizations that people like Kaz do, for us then to go back and say, can we go back and revisit this policy? Then city council will say, oh, I know I told you before we couldn't do this, but since there's people in the streets and they're yelling and they're screaming and they're demanding change, now I think maybe we can. That gets frustrating, whether it's asking for the Citizen Review Board to get the complete office, its investigatory file, or lower the threshold to have a case. City Council, all of those times said it can't be done. Then there's a homicide, or there's a police involved shooting. Now all of a sudden you can do it. And that right there is the issue. I fought the police a lot, but my bigger problem is that we elect a city council that does as much as it can to not provide oversight and not to matriculate on the knowledge that should be internal, what people call internal memory. We find ourselves having to go back and remind city council all the time. We covered this with Keith Lamont Scott. We covered it before that with Jonathan Farrell. We covered that before times with Larico Williams. How come y'all can't remember that? And how come you can't apply the pressure? And it's always us against the police, and city council seems to always get a pass.
So before I go to my next question, I just want to remind people that we have a survey up. That survey will still be available for the next 10 minutes. So please, if you haven't filled it out, please do so. There are some great questions on there, and that we can get some feedback from you all about this conversation and how we can continue to move forward. I want to go back to Cass, because Cass, you're out in the streets. You are consistently showing up for people, for groups, and you're organizing. What is the temperature of folk out there and their trust or distrust for law enforcement right now?
People are tired. You know, we've had meeting after meeting. We've gone to city council. We've talked to county commissioners. We've met with leaders separately. We've talked to Chief Putney. People are at a point right now where we're exhausted with talking, because while we're talking, Black and brown people are still being gunned down by the police. So we need to do something now. We don't have any more time to have conversations and try to work it out. We need to get it right, get it straight, and implement it before someone else gets killed. Because we are not proactive. The city council is reactionary, like Robert just said. You know, we need to get out in front of it so it doesn't happen again.
So Chief Estes, talk about de-escalation training. Is CMPD big on that? And is there a possibility for making sure that you do a lot more of that in the future?
So the answer is yes and yes, absolutely big on it. And then we are also, me personally, is one of the things that I'm heading up here is further de-escalation training. Actually, in my mind, where it matters the most for me after having done this 28 years. So de-escalation training begins with us as soon as you get to rookie school. The first day, we begin to talk about getting people to, because as you guys know, people don't generally call the police when things are going great in their life. These are generally times where, whether it's a domestic assault or something's going on, it's a terrible, traumatic time in people's lives. And so here we come and interject ourselves and try to sometimes, a lot of times, have to tell people things they don't want to hear. That's very difficult because things are emotional. It's their life. It's private. But we have to try to, convince them and talk to them and communicate with them in order to get them to do what we want to do, whether it's be, diversion or take somebody to jail if we have to, whatever it might be. Your words matter and how you deal with people matter. So what we try to do is personalize and drive that home and personalize every single encounter. So no matter who you're dealing with, these are human beings. These are folks who have lives and families and hopes and dreams and all those things. So while you're talking down to somebody, don't be surprised when they react accordingly. So that de-escalation training, how you treat people and how you talk to people is important. So, and I can go on a lot more about that. This is a subject that's near and dear to my heart. You can talk yourself into a fight any day of the week. What takes what a great officer is one who can talk themselves out of a fight or a violent situation, whatever it might be, and humanize and personalize every single encounter, no matter who you're talking to. The last part, the thing I'm working on now, and by the way, that continues. The thing I'm working on now is, what do we do when someone says is not doing exactly what we say? How do we handle that? There's a book that's out called Verbal Judo, and it talks all about how people are able to speak to people in times of crisis, whether it's a mental crisis, whether they're scared for one reason or the other, or they just don't want to be taken into custody. How do we react to that? That's when tensions are high. the time frames are shortened. Decisions have to be made right now. And we want to make sure our decisions are crystal clear with all the implications that comes along with decisions that you have to make, with good and positive outcomes for everybody. So I'm trying to drill down to the crisis points to make sure the officers are trained to slow it down, to make sure the outcomes are exactly what you want, and that there's, if possible, no violence. If possible, there's good communication. And if possible, that we have a good outcome for everyone involved. So we're doubling down on de-escalation, as it were, if I can say that in a whole.
Right. So this is a question I want to ask to everyone, because even though we can recognize techniques, we can recognize tactics, we also know there's an inherent bias that goes into policing, particularly for minorities and Black folk. So how do we address that racial bias? So I'm going to start with you, Robert.
So one, it's no secret that police specifically in the South started out as, slave patrols that eventually became organized and became police. The sheriffs was already doing the other job of court orders and things like that. It's gone all the way through that if you are an African American, my granddad tells me about his experiences with the police officer. He's passed on. My dad tells me about his experiences with the police officer. I'll tell you about mine. What we can see is that there is this pattern in practice that has been embedded in the profession. And this is not us saying that all police officers are bad. That's what we hear all the time when we bring up this, that we're anti-police. We're not anti-police. What we're saying is it's hard for African Americans to have faith in the police department when it started out as slave patrols, moved on to being mostly made up of Klan members, or allowing the Klan to even come in the cell and get Black people to take them to hang them, to after that being the people that would come on things like civil matters and lock people up over money that you owed. I forgot the term, peonage, for peonage, all the way through to today. That's a hard history to overcome. I think that there are plenty of officers that try it, but when you look at, take President Trump recently when he did the police reform, to do a police reform bill with all police officers, no common people, not to mention the white supremacy, not to mention the problem with race, infuriates Black people, because before we can do any type of what people call reconciliation, people have to admit there's a problem. And it's been very hard for police to seem to understand that. So when Black people do say that we have a problem and we don't trust the police, that doesn't mean that we don't trust every officer. There are officers in our community that do good stuff, but we still keep a look at them in the back of our mind, because you're always wondering, even though he's good to me right now, if the situation comes up to where he has to decide Robert as the individual or Robert as the Black man, which one is going to come out?
Thank you. Cass?
I just think part of what Robert said, just the difference in policing in Black communities. When we talk about how they arrive and trying to de-escalate the situation, it seems like when police arrive to even situations with guns, firearms, whatever, in the white community, there is much more of a willingness to try to de-escalate, to try to talk it out, to try to do anything they can before they go to deadly force. But when they come into the Black community, it seems like deadly force is always their first choice. And that's what the problem is. It's not them reacting to someone with a gun. It's them reacting to a person with of color with a gun, and the person winding up dead. And even when they come into the Black community, there's a huge lack of disrespect. They're amped up. It's a lot of cussing from time to time. And I feel like they need to police the Black and brown community in the same manner they police the white community, and try to de-escalate the situation and put the same value on Black life that they put on white life. I think we would see a dramatic change in how Black people are being gunned down daily, women, men, and children.
Chief?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So a couple of points. One, I won't begin to speak on behalf of every police officer out there. I think Robert's right. There are all kinds of officers out there. I think Cass would agree. What saddens me the most is when I hear, things like this, particularly, when I hear fear or when I hear officers or the perception in the Black community is that, when officers come, it's almost like an occupation or an intimidation goes on. That's the feeling. And it bothers me personally on a lot of levels. I guess the first and foremost levels, as far as a level of humanity, I guess to say I've spent my whole entire adult life trying to do right, trying to do better, trying to do good by all people. Clearly, there is something wrong somewhere if this is the way that people feel. And as long as I have the job here, it's up to me to build. Robert said there's a lack of faith and lack of trust. Well, I guess I'm going to be a faith builder and a trust builder. As Cass says, there's a intimidation and cursing and I guess depersonalization, if it were, as it were, in the Black community. Well, I will fix that too for the time that I have left. I would like to see, and one of the things that we push very hard here is to ensure that we are instilling and upholding the nobility of policing, to be guardians of the community, to be part of the community, Cass, so that they know the officers there already, so that they know them by name. It's hard to really not like somebody up close when you know their name, you know what they're about, you personalize the encounter, so as to say that police are part of the community and the community is part of the police. So that's what I'm about. That's what I'm after. What that requires, just briefly, what that requires is making sure that we, as guardians of the police, folks in senior and executive leadership, make sure that we are hiring the right officers, training the officers the right way, ensuring that we have an early intervention system, a robust one in place to see when officers are starting to go off where they're supposed to be, that we hold them accountable, and then we have good citizens review board who can back us up when we say we need to get rid of this officer or that officer, and make sure that we police our own ranks as vigorously as we would like to. So I recognize and I understand the history. I know that you're starting off from this profession that I'm in, that I chose. We're starting off from a history that's awful. No running away from it. It's awful, and we have to own that and move forward. So that's what our charge is, and that's where we're headed, to try to make it the best we can. But again, by being part of the community instead of some occupying or treating people differently.
Thank you. So now we're going to head on over and get our survey results from Afeni. So Afeni is going to come back in.
Thank you, Keith. Yeah, so we're going to switch gears for a moment and discuss the results of the audience survey. Please keep in mind that these results are only based on our audience members who completed this survey. So our first question was, which course of action would have the greatest positive impact in our city? So as you can see here, we have a slight majority of about 53% of surveyors who selected that defunding police would have the greatest positive impact in our city. The next question is, have you or someone you personally know experienced police brutality? As you can see here, we have about 59% of surveyors who selected yes, that they themselves or someone they know personally has experienced police brutality. Our next question is, to what extent has recent police brutality cases changed your perspective on law enforcement as a whole? We have here about 53% of surveyors who selected that it very much so changed their perspective on law enforcement. About 29% who selected that it has somewhat changed their perspective. And then in total, about 18% of our surveyors who selected that it has not at all changed their perspective or not really changed their perspective. So our next question was, how has police brutality most influenced your life? We have here 59% majority of surveyors who selected that they've become more vocal about the need to reform police. And we have 35% of surveyors who selected that they feel unease whenever they see a police officer. And we have a small percentage, about 6%, who selected that it completely changed the way that they view police. And our final question is which 8 can't wait policy would be most effective. As you can see here, it's pretty spread out, but our top response of about 31% of surveyors selected that it should be to require officers to exhaust all other alternatives, including non-force and less lethal force options prior to resorting to deadly force. And then we have two selections that are tied at 18.8%, which are to require officers to intervene and stop excessive force used by other officers and report these incidents immediately to a supervisor. And our last one is to require officers to report each time they use force or threaten to use force against civilians. So Keith, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Based on these survey results, was there something that stood out to you or to the panelists?
Not necessarily. I think, those results basically have told what Black people know, for a long time. And so no surprise to me. And particularly, I also work, inside law enforcement as well. And so you kind of hear some of those things on the peripheral. But I want to go to our panelists. Cass, with the survey results, anything jump out to you?
I think that's pretty on par with what people in the community are saying also. And that's how, most people feel at this particular point in time. That fear is very real. Just seeing all the police video and all the killings, and then having, some questionable shootings here in Charlotte and not knowing what happened afterwards. That's definitely the temperature of what's going on.
Robert?
One of the things that I do notice when you're looking at it on the policy side, one of the things that we've been asking for a while is a duty to intervene policy. I talked about sometimes you go straight to CMPD and you work as opposed to city council. So that happened last year with the response to resistance policy. And we made quite a few suggestions, including duty to intervene. At that time, the police chief said, don't think that we need it. I think our neglect policy covers that quite well. Don't need to worry about it. We never gave up on the policy. When George Floyd happened, we came back and revisited it and said, will you consider looking at this duty to intervene policy again? There was a change with the police department and them saying, like we've talked about before, after death, now, yes, we can do something around the lines of duty to intervene. What we didn't get was, what our opinion, a real duty to intervene policy. This is where we talk about, again, we brought you a real duty to intervene policy. Baltimore PD's duty to intervene, a couple other policies for duty to intervene. What we wound up with was extra language added to the neglect policy, which still doesn't feel what we feel is duty to intervene, because the way that it's worded, it says, if an officer sees something that rises to the level that it shocks the conscience, then you need to intervene. I think that's super subjective. Anything that's not by your SOPs should make you intervene. I think that that's what we saw with Jonathan Farrell, when one officer fired every bullet in his gun, and the other two officers, when we went to court, said, I wouldn't have handled it that way. We didn't interfere. One, because Randall Carrick was off acting so crazy. We didn't want to get shot. We look at Dan Queer's Franklin case, where there was, in our opinion, a lot of miscommunication of the commands given to him. That wouldn't rise to the level of what I think is shock the conscience, but I think that that would not be covered under their new duty to intervene. So that's not a real duty to intervene policy. And it's frustrating after asking for a year and being told no. Then after George Floyd saying, okay, we'll work on it, to then what we got, it's like, here is something to quell dissent and ask you to go away, but it's not what we asked for to start with.
And Chief, any of the survey results jump out to you?
Well, they all jump out to me. I'm not, of course, not pleased or happy with any of them, because those represent real people with real feelings about the police who in my opinion, shows well, I don't guess it's my opinion, shows a real distrust for the police in their community. And that is an absolute shame, and it's something that professionally, it's a shame to me that that's where we are. And as I stated earlier, we have work to do, but we have the resolve that we will do our very best to make sure that those survey results, get turned around. And the way you do that is one encounter at a time. The way you do that, as I said, you personalize each officer to citizen encounter. Make sure that that we are upholding all of our, as Robert's mentioned several times, where the rubber meets the roads, the SOPs and the policies, and as Cass mentioned, ensure that the officers are held accountable. That's where the most effect is seen, and that's what we intend to do.
So now we're going to take some questions from the audience. And so one of the first questions that I got is for you, Chief. The question is, how do we create that holistic reform with all interested parties coming to the table and working together?
So I think one of the ways we do it is what we're doing right here. Is we're able to bring people together to clearly represent a broad spectrum of the community. We discuss, we talk, we exchange ideas so that we can move forward in our respective areas to report back. Here's what we talked about. Here's what the community's concerns are. Here's what we can do better. And to Robert's point, here's what good policy change can look like. Second, you have to be engaged in your elected officials. If you're not happy with what they're doing, you got to tell them. You can tell them, of course, by correspondence, but also then every November, you have to go and say, this is what we want, and vote that way. Then lastly, I'll say, get to know your police department. Get to know the officers in your community. Get to know the command. every area has a captain they're responsible for that geographic area. Get to know them. They have a direct line straight up the chain to our offices up here, and that is in my opinion, it's a very effective way that people can, express their displeasure with what's going on in a particular area or neighborhood, is using the folks in their neighborhoods.
A question that I got for you, Robert. People want to know, what does your operation do? So what exactly do you do?
So I have a job with the organization as the political director. But besides for that, our organization is community organizing based. So we're in the neighborhoods every day. Each organizer knocks about, I'd say 75 doors a day to find out what's in the community that's an issue. And we have different chapters. So you've got SAFE, which is made up primarily of mothers that have lost their lives, kids' lives to police violence. You've got TORC, which is Tenant Organizing Rights Committee, which the organizers are in neighborhoods like Lake Arbor. We're the ones that sued the Lake Arbor people, apartment complex. We have our immigration rights organizers that, we worked to end 287G and to end Mecklenburg County from being able to honor ICE detainers. We've got our senior warriors, which are our seniors that work to end Medicaid and Medicare results. So issues. So when you look at it, it's all encompassing. I'm the policy part, but we're in the neighborhoods every day, all day. We just finished up, and this is COVID going on, knocking all the doors in Hidden Valley to let them know that Hidden Valley is one of the lowest census results in the neighborhood, and we need to get that up. So our staff is out every day, made up of the people impacted. And us on the policy side, take those demands from our membership to city, county, state, federal.
Thank you. For Cass and the Chief, do you think police are the best people to call for mental health or domestic disputes?
I do not. And the reason why I don't is I don't feel they're equipped to deal with the situation. I feel that we need mental health professionals to come out and to assess the situation and to help with that. Because I think so many times when people are in mental health distress, they don't know how to deal with them, and it escalates very quickly, and in most cases it ends with someone being killed.
So I'd like to agree with Cass on this one. Since I've been here since the early 90s, I've seen a real shift, and I can't put my finger on where where it's come from, but a real shift in policing towards dealing with folks who are in mental health crisis. I'm not smart enough to figure out what happened, if it is even, just my perception or not. But to Cass's point, folks are in mental health crisis. It's a lot of times it's a result of some clinical thing that's going on. It can be a medication thing. There's a lot of things that go on with that. And she's right. Though we train officers in crisis intervention training, we have hundreds and hundreds of officers that we put, and we're going to train them all, and we're getting very close to that. And we've also created a specific unit, so with clinicians attached, that when we get calls involving folks in mental health crisis, they're the ones that go, so that we can, to Cass's point, we can get a mental health professional to intervene. And a lot of times we find that that is the correct person to deal with a person as a mental health professional. We're certainly not. So I believe that she's right. Now, moving on to the domestic violence part. If it's a domestic dispute and there's no violence attached, then of course, in my experience, I have been the domestic violence counselor just by the nature of getting a domestic violence call. And you go there and there's no violence, then you end up being a pseudo counselor to try to sort out the situation that's going on. So a lot of times, if there's no abuse going on, if there, physical abuse, verbal abuse, that kind of thing, where, a person may feel like they can't escape, there's no ex parte, in other words, there's no emergency that's going on, then yes, absolutely, a domestic counselor would be preferable. The domestic one's a little bit harder because a lot of times we get calls where, a neighbor will call, and one of the two people involved in the situations was afraid to call themselves, and they have been abused, and so some abuse gets reported that way. Of course, I think we all agree there are times we have to intervene when people are being abused.
This question, I think, is for either Cass or Robert. How does one join the Citizens Review Board?
You want me to ask it? So,
Yes.
all right. So people serve on the Citizen Review Board in 2-year terms, and you can be signed up you can re-sign up for another term. What the Citizen Review Board requires, if you look on the City of Charlotte's website and you click on committees, you'll see a list of all of the committees when there is a vacancy. City council members appoint people to the Citizens Review Board. The mayor gets 3 appointments. Each city council person gets 1. There's a requirement for the Citizen Review Board that you attend the Citizens Academy if you're going to serve on the Citizen Review Board or the Civil Service Board. So you first would sign up expressing your interest. If there's a place already in the Citizens Academy, you can go and do your Citizen Academy work without the appointment so that you're ready when there's a time for an appointment. If not, we have the rules now to where you can be appointed and you can still attend. There's coursework which we've worked to help reform. In our opinion, it was too top loaded at the very beginning on police and not as much on community. We've addressed that several times, and now we're more happy with the training that you get to serve on either board. But it's an appointment, and to be honest, there is usually appointments because people don't know, it seems, how to get on the board. One of the changes that we had made back in 2014 when we won some changes to the Citizen Review Board that we're not happy with is that the city committed to advertising and making sure that 1, people knew how to serve on the board, and 2, how to bring a case to the board. What we've seen from door knocking and talking and telling people about it, that there's so many people that don't even know the Citizen Review Board exists. And that's, again, something else that the city needs to do a better job on advertising and making sure they keep those positions full.
Chief, so speaking of advertising, I think this question speaks to police candidates. How are they screened? And are there ways to identify those who are racist before allowing them to join the force?
Yeah, well, we do our very best to make sure that we screen people. We have them go for a psychological exam and all of those things to try to bring out any biases that they may have, so that they don't bring those out to the professional workplace. In other words, they don't get hired. So if there's any way we can use the professional means of testing and interviews and all that, if we get any kind of sniff of that in a review that we get, they're out. If we have a last step, which is a review of staff there. And if, we ask questions specifically, we put them on, do them a polygraph to make sure that they're being truthful. So we do our very, very best to make sure that, and this is over and above what the state law requires. So these are things that we do and look at it this way. Not only are we protecting the community, and we really believe that's one of the things that we do by make sure we have good standards to, on the one hand, make sure we're representative and reflective of the community we serve. On the other hand, we make sure that we're good, upstanding citizens who can meet the requirements of the state, and then also make sure that they meet the standards of the city of Charlotte, the police department, because we want to make sure that we add good people to our ranks. Because if we don't, it means that we're undermining the very thing that we stand for.
And so other questions that are in the box, they really just center around training, Chief. I think people want to know a lot about what is the training process for CMPD, particularly, again, as it relates to de-escalation, that military are trained to de-escalate situations. Are the police trained for that? Again, identification of officers or candidates as they're coming through your process. This seems to be the thread that folk want to know. What is, I guess, what's behind the curtain? What's happening as folk are signing up? They're going through your process, and what does that training look like?
Yeah, well, first off, just to say, state has a requirement of how many hours that a person who's coming in for what they call BLET, basic law enforcement training, what that requires. We go about double. So for our police academy, it's just at 6 months long. And as I stated earlier, de-escalation starts at the beginning. We have a whole host of less than lethal options, the first of which is our words. As I said earlier, to try to ensure everybody understands that every interaction starts with the words that you say, how you communicate, make sure that you communicate effectively to everybody, right? Not just people on one side of town or the other, or a rich person or a poor, everybody, right? That's one of the requirements that you have to be able to do. Also, you have to be, of course, empathetic. You have to, understand that people are all in all different situations when we're interacting with them. There are a lot of times where, as I said earlier, we don't go into the best of situations. You have to go in there and understanding, expecting that. Now, as far as the nuts and bolts of it, we have a continuum. I know Robert's very familiar with the continuum that we have. That speaks of from officer presence to verbal commands to all the different from pepper sprays to the tasers that we have heard so much about, to we have 40 millimeter options where people who may have a knife or something in their hand that we can try to de-escalate there, and by and large we do. And it sounds counterintuitive, particularly when we hear the things that Cass spoke about earlier, but we do de-escalate the vast majority of our encounters. Not all of them, of course, and one is too many, but we get, just so we understand, we get 1 million calls a year, 350 some odd thousand we respond to, and we're able to do most of our work, the vast majority of it, without using force. And that goes to show some de-escalation. In fact, our tactical team, the SWAT team you see on TV and all that, they are absolute masters of de-escalation. Some of those folks are very good at it. They utilize negotiation tactics. They're able to use space and distance and time to separate themselves, ensure that people are given time to calm down and whatever. Again, we're not perfect. I'm not saying that we get it all right, But I am saying that we have a robust training program at the front end, and then we train every year on tactics and techniques just like this to make sure that we're doing everything we can to keep ourselves out of physical confrontations or using force on someone when it's unnecessary. And when we do, it is the least amount of force to overcome the resistance that's being presented to you at the time, period.
So I have one final question for each of you. So if you can try to be as brief as possible, but how do you think reform will look in Charlotte versus other major cities? So I'm going to start with Robert.
So again, I think that if you compare Charlotte to some cities in the country on the top list, that we are, above them. I would say that you could look at some of the people that are listed there, and we are below them. Reform takes on the way that what the city is going to be able, has the political will to do. We can work with the police all day, but if the city does not have the political will to stand, provide oversight, pass the policy changes that we're asking for, accept the fact that people do not believe that reform needs to be the end of it, but that we need to reduce the footprint and size of the police and look to use some of the money that goes to things like community policing and the police's PR budget to fund programs like Cahoots, to fund violence interruption so that the police don't have to be in the neighborhoods, but the community is building stronger and building capacity to take care of itself. We're not going to be moving up that list. If the city decides that it has the political will to work on those things that I just mentioned, then we may be surprised on where the city will be in the next few years.
Chief.
Yeah, on this topic, I'll respectfully disagree with my friend, Mr. Dawkins. I do believe that we are well ahead of many agencies out there. And I have I guess the inside baseball to know that there are many, many agencies out there who have, for whatever reason, developed a us versus them mentality. They build up walls between the community themselves, and they want to keep operating on the status quo. I think you'll find, and probably Robert would even agree with me, that we are not content to operate on a status quo. As I said, we're a learning agency. We have open dialogue. I'm not going to say we'll always agree on every SOP or policy, but we're listening. We know that the community is that's our boss. At the end of the day, that's who we serve. You've heard the old term protect and serve. We get it. We understand. We're only as effective as the community who we serve. So I think what reform looks like is when you have progress being made on the way the police operate, having the community have a say, and that we work on them together. In other words, you come to say, here's the goal that we want to reach, and then allow us to say, okay, here's a way that we think we can really get us closer to that goal, and keep moving forward as we do that. If not, the community say they want this all day long. They push it on the police department. The police department says, oh, wait a minute, we can't because of X, Y, and Z. And then, as Cass pointed out earlier, the next thing pops up. Everybody's frustrated, and we've had this push-pull. What we'd rather do is hear where Robert wants to go, Cass wants to go, community members wants to go from across the city, and let us help you get there. And if we can't get there 100%, at least we can explain, here's our position.
Thank you. Cass?
I think if the community was the boss of the police department at this point in time, they would be fired. I'm just going to be honest. Now, I love the conversation that we're having right now about working together and letting the community have input, but that pie chart really represented how the people feel in Charlotte about what's going on. And I agree with Robert as far as defunding the police. I mean, they're getting $290-some million of the budget. We need to take at least $100 million of that and put it into the community, into affordable housing, into development, into job creation, into all of the things that Robert was talking about, because then we wouldn't have the level of crime that we have. So we wouldn't have the need for the police to be over-policing our communities. And I think, we're having these conversations, and it's wonderful. But I would really like to see action, and not action that has to happen when the next person gets killed. Robert is working on policy, and Robert has been working on policy and doing the work. And I understand his frustration because he, like he said, he comes with good policy and it gets watered down. We need to stop watering down these policies and really implement them if we're really trying to actually have change in our community and build trust with all of our citizens in our community.
Thank you. So this concludes the question and answer portion of the night. I'm going to get ready to say good night and goodbye to our panelists. First up, Cass, thank you again, as always, for everything that you're doing. 10 seconds, any closing remarks?
I think we all need to continue to unite and work together on the policy level, on having a protest, showing up, putting pressure on elected officials, making sure we come out to these meetings, coming to city council meetings, and paying attention to what's being passed and who's passing it, so we know who to apply the pressure to, and continuing to do the work.
Thank you, Queen. You have a great evening.
Thank you.
Robert, my man.
So what I would say is still same thing that Cass says. I appreciate the people that are in the streets every day protesting. I appreciate Chief Estes and what CMPD has done on their own and with help from outside help from like activists. I think that there is a way, if we can get rid of barriers, have common outcomes that we're shooting for, not to be shot down, that we can make more changes. I know when I said I didn't think that Charlotte was the top of the list of comparable cities, I hope Chief wasn't thinking that I was saying we're at the bottom. I don't in any way believe that, but I do believe there's obstacles that we need to overcome. And if the police, if city council can hear what the people are in the streets are saying, internalize that, try their best to hear it, accept what we're trying to bring as policy without changing it, and for everybody to understand that we're trying to make it better and it's not something that we're trying to do to hurt the police. And we come to that table, I think we can make change.
Thank you so much, Robert. You have a good evening, man. I'll see you soon. And finally, Chief, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Some final thoughts.
Yeah, here's what I'd like to say finally. When people say the police, just want to remind them that the police isn't one person, even one entity. It's made up of a bunch of individuals who I can personally attest, they're the vast majority want to do the right thing, are doing the right thing, and really are, personally upset about what some of the things that they've seen going on, and are dedicated to doing, to serving, mankind. So I just want to say that when we're talking about that, just everyone just recognize that we're here, we're listening, we're human beings, and we're ready to make sure that we police the community in the way that's fair and just, and we're doing the very best we can at it, and we look forward to moving forward together.
Thank you very much, Chief, and you stay safe out there.
Thank you.
And finally, as we get ready to wrap up tonight, I want to make sure we recognize the family and friends of the 3 individuals that lost their lives on Beatties Ford Road: Jamar Cassell, Kelly Miller, Christopher Gleaton. These conversations are vitally important, so we want to thank the Gantt Center for allowing us the safe space to have this conversation. Our art institutions are doing amazing work, so make sure you support them, because art is activism. So at this time, I'll now send it back over to Afeni.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you so much for moderating tonight's conversation. And thank you for mentioning the importance of this type of work. So we are proud to be a platform that dives into issues that are affecting us in real time. With our Text to Give platform, you keep these timely programs alive. By texting Unmasked to 345-345, you can conveniently support the Gantt Center in the furthering of our mission. Of course, we thank you in advance for your support. We thank you for your contributions to the Gantt Center. And we, of course, thank you for being a part of tonight's conversation. As always, please be safe and take care. Good night.